I've got this. This morning, we need to find out how we got where we are today. How has society reached this point? I believe it's because passionate people have made a difference in society. And I want to ask you this morning, what are you passionate about? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir this morning, but there are individuals throughout history who have made an impact on society. And I am thoroughly convinced that it's individuals who change societies. She had a passionate and was passionate for the less fortunate. This young man was passionate that men should be judged by the content of their heart and not the color of their skin. He was passionate that violence wasn't the path to peace. His passion for the unknown convinced him there is a God, even though he was the smartest man on earth, and yet never to take himself seriously. How many of you recognize this pastor from Germany? His passion for the black churches in Harlem while he was a seminary student there led him to conspire to kill Hitler. In fact, all of the gentlemen you see in this photograph were executed by the socialist Nazi regime. His name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a pastor. He was passionate about the truth and would not compromise. How many of you recognize this woman? Don't be fooled by the book that she's holding. She was passionate, very passionate. How many of you recognize the pastor on the right? He happened to have been my pastor, W.A. Criswell. Her name, Madeleine Murray O'Hare. She was passionate that children should not read the Bible or pray in school. Then Texas Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson was passionate against his political opponents. But his passion had unintended consequences for churches and pastors. How many of you recognize this man? Seriously, how many of you recognize him? Raise your hand. One or two. This man had a passion for education, educating your children. In fact, if you are a product of the public school system, you are influenced by this man's philosophy. He has shaped how you think about yourself as an individual and how you relate to society. His name is John Dewey, father of modern education in America. Here's what he thought about being an individual. You can't make socialist out of individualist. Children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone is interdependent. Could this be a reason why classroom settings, physical classroom settings, have gone to where children have their own independent desk, where they learn to think and reason and solve problems for themselves, to now we've gone to circular desks called learning centers, where students learn to solve problems collectively? How many of you recognize this innocent-looking spinster? Could have been your grandmother, your third grade teacher as far as that's concerned. This woman had a passionate plan for parents and their babies. Her name, Margaret Sanger. She was founder of Planned Parenthood. And to give you a couple of quotes, she said, "We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population," unquote. Another of her quotes, "More children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief aim of birth control." This is a philosophy that founded Planned Parenthood. There was a dictator in Europe whose Margaret's Malthusian eugenics caught his attention. And he incorporated her philosophy because he had a passion for a master race. And his plan included Planned Parenthood and women's health care in the form of baby factories. Also a youth corps, daycare for working moms, and freedom schools for teenagers, and yes, retirement for minorities. Planned Parenthood was very passionate. You say, "Pastor, that's not what Planned Parenthood is about today. Planned Parenthood today is about women's health." Really? Well, why is it that 4 out of 5 Planned Parenthood clinics are located in minority neighborhoods with blacks as the primary target? About 1/3 of all abortions performed are on blacks. In fact, according to the Black Americans for Life in Washington, D.C., in 25 years, 64% of all deaths in the black community were by abortion. This is the face of Planned Parenthood. This is Margaret Sanger's successor, Cecile Richards, who had center stage last week in Charlotte, North Carolina at the DNC convention. Planned Parenthood is not about women's health. Planned Parenthood is about more children from the fit, less children from the unfit. So passionate people have made a difference in our society. And it will be passionate individuals who will make a difference in our society to get us back to where we have fallen. Oscar Wilde said, "Life imitates art more often than art imitates life." And I agree with him. Unless you agree with me that Photoshop imitates life. How is it that we've gone in our cultural setting, in our arts, in our entertainment, Hollywood, in less than 60 years we've gone from the Munsters on television, who by the way were a very healthy, normal family. They were comfortable with their differences in a society that considered them different. And then to the blended family, the Brady Bunch, to the new normal. How has that happened? We've gone from Father Knows Best, who knew best, and was respected by his wife and children, to Married with Children, to The Simpsons. Every sitcom today on television that betrays the biblical family ridicules the father's authority and his integrity. How is it that a generation raised in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood now lives in Howard Stern's perverted backyard? We've gone from Peter, Paul, and Mary, I've got a hammer, to Kiss, God gave us rock and roll. The new normal. How did we get here? By accident? Is it just a matter of social evolution, or do we believe in social engineering? Is there such a thing as social creationism? The answer to that is yes. There is a divine, I will put this in parentheses, there is an intelligent design behind social engineering. It began in 1883 in London, the year, by the way, that Karl Marx died. A group of English intellectuals formed a new socialist organization called London Fabian Socialist, or Society. Most Americans are not aware of the Fabian Socialist in America, but they are here. They have infiltrated every portion and segment of our society, whether it's education, government, entertainment, Hollywood, and unfortunately our seminaries and our churches. It was founded by Beatrice and Sidney Webb. You'll see here, and then also George Bernard Shaw. Remember, in the 1800s, the entertainment industry was arts and literature. There was no radio, no television, and no internet. And so the arts were used to promote Fabian philosophy. Their crest, their shield, is a sheep in wolf's clothing. Or, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Still early yet. Their goals were to be achieved by passing new laws. See, Marxists are revolutionary socialists. Fabians are evolutionary socialists. They understood that a Judeo-Christian society could not be taken over by revolution, that you could not get people in the streets killing one another. And so their goal was to implement environmentalism. Does EPA ring a bell this morning? Their philosophy, man was not created by God. He is the product of his surroundings. To change man, simply manipulate. Manipulate the economic, political, and social environment. Manipulation equals crisis management. Crisis management is creating a crisis that you manipulate, and the answer to that crisis you already have pre-planned. FDR had a man named Stuart Chase. He was a Fabian Socialist. It was Chase who coined the term the New Deal. Fabian Socialism has infiltrated all of our thinking. Some of you may remember this book from last year on the New York Times bestseller list, Change the Culture, Change the Game. And the premise of that book is the same premise as Fabian Socialism. Now, I'm not saying those authors are Fabian Socialists. I'm just saying that Fabian Socialism and its philosophy has permeated our society to the point we don't recognize it when we see it. And the philosophy of Fabian Socialism is this, that man's belief is shaped by his experiences. His experience in education, his experience in religion, his experience with his history, his experience with government, and his economic experience. You change a man's experience. You change society's experiences. You change that by the way of what they experience in art and entertainment, etc. When you change their experience, you change their beliefs. When you change their beliefs, you change their actions. When you change their actions, you change society. So what is taking place in the church and American culture? Why is the line between right and wrong constantly moving to the left? Why do we no longer recognize in our pulpits biblical truth? Our biblical worldview has been replaced, unfortunately, even in seminaries and pulpits across America, with a Fabian Socialist worldview. We are no longer a nation of principles but preference. We are tossed by the whirlwinds of our own carnal appetites upon the sea of moral relativism. To use an illustration of my good friend and boss, Jim Garlow, if 30 years ago I would have said from the pulpit that tearing a baby from a mother's womb is murder, no one would object to that. But if I say that today in the pulpit, people will say, "Pastor, you're too political." If 25 years ago I would have said in my pulpit that homosexual behavior is wrong, it's sin, people would not have disagreed. But I say that today, they'll say, "Pastor, you're too political." 15 years ago, if I would have said in my pulpit that marriage between one man and one woman is what God has designed, no one would have argued with me. But I say that today, they would have said, "Pastor, you're too political." See, same-sex marriage is not an issue of right or left. It's a matter of right and wrong. Same-sex marriage is not left, it's sin. Abortion is not left, it's sin. Homosexual behavior is not left, it is sin. Our world is changing rapidly, and it's changing because of individuals who are passionate about what they believe and are willing to dedicate themselves and even give their lives to change another culture. We are in crisis. Where will it all end? There are 6 major issues I want to discuss here briefly. 6 major foundations that God has given in His Word in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. They are sanctity of life, gender identity, biblical marriage, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and yes, free enterprise. A free enterprise system is dependent on the previous 5. You cannot have a free economy, you cannot have a prosperous economy if you redefine the first 3, and that is what is happening in America. We are redefining sanctity of life because Fabian Socialism says man is not created in the image of God. Man was created in the image of God. Gender identity is a big issue. In fact, today in California already has laws on their books that if a 16-year-old boy Monday morning wakes up and decides he's a girl, and he goes to school and informs the school officials that he's no longer a male, he's a female, they have to allow him to use the girls' locker room in phys ed class. Now, I want to know one thing. I've got one thing to ask. Where was that law when I was 16 years old? Men and women are created unique for the purpose of biblical marriage. Biblical marriage and same-sex marriage are like 2 locomotives on the same track going head-on at full speed. They both cannot survive in the same society. Whenever biblical marriage is redefined in a society, individuals within that society lose personal freedoms. They lose parental rights. You can no longer dictate what your children are being taught in school. Johnny has 2 mommies. Freedom of speech is lost. We'll talk about that in a moment. And also religious freedom. The purpose of biblical marriage, God says, is for procreation and connecting generations to one another. Same-sex marriage can do neither. Children establish their ancestry, their identity through biblical, natural marriage. Same-sex marriage cannot. Same-sex marriage, proponents for same-sex marriage say, well, we have adoption. Adoption is providing children with the parents, a mother and a father that they need. Adoption is not providing adults with children they want. The greatest victim in this redefinition of biblical principles that God gives for society is the freedom of speech. And once a society loses freedom of speech, it loses free enterprise. God has tied these principles together. He knew what was best for a society. President Dwight Eisenhower said, "I believe without free enterprise, there can be no democracy." Our forefathers knew this when they wrote the founding documents. George Washington said, "If freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent may we be led like sheep to the slaughter." Thomas Jefferson said, all tyranny needs is to gain a foothold, all tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. And if I may paraphrase that this morning, all tyranny needs, all Fabian socialism needs to gain a foothold is for America's clergy to remain silent.
Right. 'Cause, 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 'cause
Our forefathers came here 400 years ago. They landed on Plymouth Rock, seeking to escape from the despotism, the tyranny that existed in Europe, the socialism that existed in Europe. Europe's Reformation and America's Revolution were both led by preachers. It was the politicians who followed the preacher's lead. Regardless of your theological feelings about Europe's Reformation gave the world two very unique individuals: the American clergy and the American statesman, or the preacher and the politician. And it was the American clergy who lit the fires, the ideals of freedom in the hearts and minds of America's colonists. In fact, the American pulpits were the ramparts of the American Revolution. It was the preacher and the politician who first held the reins of this fledgling republic in their hands. It was they who plowed deep the furrows of freedom in the hearts of men and sowed the seeds of liberty and justice. Preachers like George Whitefield, preachers who were feared by the crown. How many of you know the story of Paul Revere? He left Boston that night, or rather Boston that evening, with one destination in mind, and that was the home of Reverend Jonas Clark of Christ Church in Lexington, Massachusetts. In the home of Jonas Clark that evening were two politicians. Reverend Clark was not only the most powerful preacher in his community, he was the most prominent politician. And in his home that evening, when Paul Revere rode to Clark's home, were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. When Paul Revere arrived with the news that the British were coming, both Hancock and Adams asked the pastor, "Preacher, are your people, is your congregation ready for this?" And how many of you can say that your pastor says the same thing that Jonas Clark replied to both Adams and Hancock? Jonas Clark said to those politicians, "For this very hour have I trained them." How many of you has your pastor trained you and prepared you for what's ahead for America? And so that evening, Jonas Clark called his deacon board together. They were the greeting committee of Christ Church. And they met the British that next morning on the green in Lexington, and the shot that was heard round the world was started by a pastor and his congregation. And he told his deacon board and other Minutemen who joined him there in Lexington not to fire the first shot. God would not honor an offensive war. And so those patriot Christians stood on the church or the green there in Lexington and took the first volley from the British. And after the smoke cleared, there were 18 casualties on Lexington Green, 8 of them members of Christ Church, the congregation of Pastor Clark. The first casualties of the American Revolution were Christians. The British then proceeded to the Concord Bridge, where another pastor and his congregation turned the British back. How many of you have heard the story of Wentworth Cheswell? Most of us have not been told in our revised history classes. There were 2 men who left Boston that evening. Lexington, Revere, we all know. He left and went west to Lexington. The British went west, so that's the story we're told. But there was a black American named Wentworth Cheswell. He rode north to warn the pastors and their congregations the British were coming. He, along with Revere, were both devout followers of Jesus Christ. When the British left Concord and began their march back to Boston, it was Wentworth Cheswell and several thousand pastors and members of their congregation that decimated the British Army on the way back to Boston. It was pastors who led this nation. Pastors. 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence held degrees in either a seminary or a Bible college degree. Pastors like John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who understood the conflict that Pastor Dykes and I face even now in the year 2012. Not all pastors were gung-ho in 1700s about getting involved politically with the Revolution. In fact, John Peter had a brother named Frederick, had a large megachurch, I guess you could say, in New York. And he was very critical of his brother John for leaving the pulpit and raising a 300-man militia from his congregation to get involved in the Revolution. He was critical until a year later that the British marched on New York and burned Frederick's church to the ground. He got involved very quickly. I wonder, pastors, how many of you is it going to take the British Fabian Socialism burning your church to the ground before you're going to wake up and realize that you need to get involved? So Frederick Muhlenberg became involved. In fact, he became the first Speaker of the House of Representatives. These pastors were known as the Black Robe Regiment, so feared by King George III. They were ordered to be shot on sight. So powerful were these pastors at being disseminators of truth. My question is, where are the pastors today? Where is our Black Robe Regiment? The problem is not in politics. The problem is not in Washington. The problem is not with a man who sits behind a desk every day on Pennsylvania Avenue. The problem is with people who are sitting in the pews every Sunday morning in the Lord's house. That's the problem. It's also the problem is with the pastors. The voice of the Great Awakening, Charles Finney, said this: the pulpit is responsible. A great sermon he preached about 1.5 years before his death. Brethren, speaking to preachers, our preaching will bear its legitimate fruits. If immorality prevails in the land, the fault is ours to a great degree. If there is decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible. If the public press, boy, does this ever apply? If the public press lacks moral discrimination, the pulpit is responsible. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible. If the world loses interest in religion, if Satan rules in the halls of our legislation, if our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit is responsible. Well, how has this happened? How have we gone from a nation in 200 years whose foundation was based upon the Bible, the Word of God, and led by pastors, to where now we are redefining in our society the very things that God said you better leave alone? We're defining sanctity of life, redefining gender identity, redefining biblical marriage. How is this happening? What is the philosophy, the strategy of Fabian socialism? It's very simple. It's this: take what is moral and politicize it. Politicize sin. Once a moral issue becomes a political issue, it can be legislated. And once it's legislated, and individuals are given then a minority status. This is collective rights. That minority is then given civil rights. Those civil rights of the new minority must then be protected by law. And so criticism of the new minority is labeled hate speech and a violation of their civil rights. So what was once under the authority of the church and was to be addressed by the pastors of our nation has now come under the authority of the state and under the legislation of politicians. So to maintain the new Fabian socialist status quo, there had to be a strong separation of church and state. Once the state has taken from the church the question we are facing today as pastors and as politicians and political activists, can the church reclaim it from the state? There were 4 key Supreme Court decisions and congressional decisions. I'm going to cover 3 of them here. Pastor Dykes will be covering the second in detail, the Johnson Amendment. I will briefly mention that in my presentation. But there are 4 major Supreme Court decisions and 1 congressional decision that have reinforced Fabian socialism in our society. The first is Everson versus the Board of Education in 1947. Very briefly, this was a case where a private citizen in a watchdog group brought a case against the local Board of Education because the Board of Education was reimbursing parents who their children took the public transportation to a private religious school, and the tax group felt that it was a violation of separation of church and state that the school board would reimburse parents who were sending their kids via public transportation to religious schools. By the way, other parents were using the same transportation for their kids to get to public school. Well, the Supreme Court ruled on favor of the school board. But what was the keynote or the key factor that began an erosion to these pillars in our society was the opinion that Justice Hugo Black gave, which there was a split decision in the court as to the fact that he overstepped his interpretation of the constitutionality of separation in church and state. Nonetheless, his interpretation was that there had to be a strong wall of separation between church and state. It was this decision that has later been used to take prayer out of any public school activity. The second key this is a congressional decision. Again, Pastor Dykes will elaborate on this. It's the Johnson Amendment on July 2nd, 1954. This was the day that changed everything for the churches in America and muzzled America's clergy for the past 58 years. And as a result of that action of then Senator Johnson he was aggravated at H.L. Hunt and Frank Gannett for their opposition to his senatorial race, and so it gave the Internal Revenue power, and the first time for 166 years pulpit freedom in America ended. Pastor's speech was silenced from the pulpit. Now the third, and I believe one of the most important and one of the most devastating decisions upon our society, was the case of Abington School District versus Shemp. This decision before the Supreme Court was joined with a lot of other cases. The more popular case was Madeleine Murray O'Hare. This is the day they took prayer and Bible reading out of school. And I want to ask us today, what have been the consequences of the Supreme Court deciding for us, legislative judges deciding for us what is best for our children? In other words, once again, I want you to see Fabian Socialism working out here. At this decision, the first decision separated church and state. The second decision silenced the pulpit. So now Americans are experiencing something different when they go to church. Pastors are silent. Now our children are experiencing a different form of education. How many of you know our children are not being educated the way we were? There's a reason. It's not by chance. It's social engineering. What have been the consequences? This you may find humorous and really tragic at the same time. How many of you were in high school in 1940? The top 7 problems in school: talking out of turn, chewing gum, making noise, running in the halls, cutting in line, dress code violations, littering. In 1990, the top 7 were drug abuse, alcohol abuse, pregnancy, suicide, rape, robbery, and assault. How is it in America, in less than one generation, we've gone from a classroom setting like this to, unfortunately and tragically, every year we see more and more of Columbine situations that are perpetrated by lone random actors? Since 1963, when we took prayer and Bible reading out of school, pregnancies in girls the ages 15 through 19, before 1963 it was only 15 in 1,000. Since 1963, pregnancies in that girls' age group has risen 187%. For girls in the ages of 10 to 14, pregnancies after 1963 are up 553%. Sexually transmitted diseases were around 400 per 100,000 students. Now it's been up 226% in the last 12 years. Some of you may remember the case of these girls at Gloucester High School. They made a pregnancy pact to all get pregnant at the same time. What about the family? After 1963, divorces increased 300% each year. So, what is happening? Who is suffering? It's the children. Remember, Fabian Socialists are after our children. They're not about instant revolution. They are about social evolution. In education, since 1963, the SAT scores have rapidly declined, even though the same test was used since 1941. Back in 1963, there were only 1,000 Christian schools in America. Within the next 25 years, there are 32,000. And the SAT scores for private schools are nearly 100 points above public schools, about the same rate or the same place they were before 1963. There you can see a chart of the drop-off of our SAT scores since 1963. What about the nation? Crime has increased 544%. Illegal drugs have become an epidemic, and the nation has lost 55 million citizens due to abortion. Why is it now we have the listing of the top 10 major crime cities in America? Is America literally going to pot? The fourth Supreme Court decision was Roe v. Wade, making abortion legal. It is the war on the unborn. It is the American Holocaust. When the Supreme Court decided that it was all about women's health, the camel got his nose under the tent. This is the New York Times front page. Is it ironic that Lyndon Johnson died on the same day that the Supreme Court legalized abortion for the first 3 months of pregnancy? Now, this 8-month-old American in the womb no longer has First, Second, or Fourth Amendment rights. His life is in jeopardy every moment, even up to the point of leaving the womb. So the war goes on. Abortion is not health care. Abortion is about life. What is taking place in our society? What can we do to change it? Pastor Dykes is going to share with us several organizations, national organizations. This is the organization that I'm thankful to be a part of, Renewing American Leadership in Washington, D.C. I'm Director of Church Relations, and I work with some very talented, wonderful people in Washington, California, and Arizona. REAL was founded by Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House. It's now led by Dr. Jim Garlow. Some of the things that REAL has been involved in, we were an important factor in writing legislation for key laws that were passed in the House on balancing the budget. At this very hour, we have legislation, we have an amendment written that if we get a majority in the House and the Senate, it will be presented to the floor of Congress to be voted on. It is an amendment to the Constitution to define what is marriage, and that is between one man and one woman. This is Dr. Jim Garlow. We were at a press conference at the Capitol. Dr. Dykes will be sharing on the Family Research Council. We have some wonderful packets as you leave today. Please pick one up. They're free. They are cultural impact manuals and also some voter registration toolkits. That's Dr. Tony Perkins there on your right. Also, Pastor Dykes will be telling you about Alliance Defending Freedom. What's at stake in this election is more than just a president. The next president will most likely appoint 4 new Supreme Court justices. Scalia just turned 78. Kennedy will turn 78 later this year. Breyer will be 76 in August. Ginsburg turned 81. Ginsburg has pancreatic cancer. Stevens has already said he would retire and is just waiting for Obama to be reelected. It's more about the Supreme Court judges that will have a greater impact on our culture and society in the generation to come. If this will shock you any, can you imagine Chief Justice Eric Holder? The problem, and as a pastor I hate to say this, there are 60 to 70 million evangelicals in America. 50% of the people sitting next to you in your pew on Sunday morning are not registered to vote. And of those who are, only about 30%, or rather 25% of them don't make it to the polls. Do you realize that the last presidential election was determined by 9.5 million votes? That was it, 9.5 million votes. Do the math. 10 million Christians did not vote in the last presidential election. You will make a difference if you're passionate about what you believe. It only takes one. I know you know the butterfly effect. You can be that butterfly. God can take you and use you to change this world. You can make a difference. You say, but I'm only one. Well, Everett Hale left us a great prose that says, I am only one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And what I can do that I ought to do, and what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I shall do. Thank you very much. God bless you, and God bless America.